where would a talk be on war given by an academic if we didn't begin with Clausewitz? So my apologies for doing that. But the question that I've put is a Clausewitzian question. Clausewitz, memorably, had a very simple categorization of war, which is that we can understand the nature of war, which doesn't change, and we can understand that the character of war does change. And that's how we deal with the fact that there are elements of continuity within war and how there are elements of change. And the things that Clausewitz saw as continuous is, above all, and people forget this so often because they think of Clausewitz as the man who talks about the relationship between war and policy, that he begins by saying, in the opening chapter of Book 1 of On War, I think it's the second line, war is a clash of wills. At the heart of war is reciprocity. It's what two sides do to each other. You can't have a war on its own. And the second, or on the bullet points, of course, it's now third, the second point about war is at its heart is the business of killing. It needs violence. And it's not just, of course, being the victim of violence, it's carrying out violence. Clausewitz is at his most graphic. The German can often be complex. It can often be typical sentences which have no obvious subject, as so often in early 19th century German, and you forget where the verb is. But when it comes to the violence of battle, he is graphic and to the point. That, for him, is central to how we think about war. But above all, war is subject to confusion, chaos. And some of that is a product of accident. Some of it is a product of nature. The weather can change, the fog can come down, it can suddenly turn into an incredibly hot or sunny day. They, in the early 19th century, were less good at forecasting that than we are. Not that Norwegians or Britons are any good at it, it would seem. We're still surprised by the weather, but they were surprised even more often than we are. And it is characterized by the fact that you put a large group of human beings, particularly academics, in a conference room and ask them to do things, and they won't do it as you tell them to do it. When you're under orders, you do it rather better. You think military organization is designed to help, but the military can also make things incredibly complicated and bureaucratic. And he calls all of that friction. But of course, as I said at the very beginning, what we think about in relation to war is that normatively, it is instrumental. The point about Clausewitz is that although at the one hand war is chaotic and confusing, states use it, and he was talking predominantly about states, but not exclusively about states, I hasten to add, despite the views of some critics, that war is at least normatively instrumental. You go to war for a purpose. It has a political goal. Oh, what have I done now? Turned it off, sorry. But by contrast, and this is what we actually deal with in the real world on a daily basis, in the context within which war occurs does change continuously. And he characterized this as the character of war. And that mattered to him enormously, because in his own lifetime, he was born in 1780, he first went to war in 1792 in the War of the First Coalition, before he was even a teenager. In his lifetime, war changed fundamentally. It changed in ways which were predominantly driven by the French Revolution, by the mobilization of the power of the state in the name of the people, which enabled states, when using war, to do things that were more awful, more violent, and more extreme than anything that they had thought they had experienced in the 18th century. The 18th century had been marked by pretty recurrent wars, but on the other hand, not war on the scale in terms of social and economic mobilization that was experienced between 1792 and 1815. And Clausewitz addressed this question in Book 8 of On War. There's a famous chapter where he begins with Alexander the Great, it runs forward to Gustavus Adolphus, and ends essentially with Napoleon and the Revolution. And he says, look at this, war is peculiar to its own times. It is a reflection of its own times, as well as having these enduring qualities. Now, the point about beginning with this is that for much strategic theory, this is, and strategic theory may be a contradiction in terms, I'll come to that point at the end, but for much strategic theory, this is essential to the debate, that there is something that links, let's say, the Athenians and Spartans in the Peloponnesian War to what is happening now between Russia and Ukraine, or indeed what is happening on the Israeli-Palestine border. In our own time, something that was significant, less significant to Clausewitz, has become much more significant to us. That is, you cannot read about contemporary conflict without being told continuously that the war is changing in dramatic and unprecedented ways, that technology, above all, is having a significant effect, a driving effect in how war is fought. And of course, that is true. But the question is it true enough to change war in fundamental ways, so much so that we can no longer argue that there is a clear distinction between the nature and the character of war, that things have changed so radically that the technological innovation has been a key driver in what we are doing to each other when we go to war. And the reason that does matter, and it shouldn't be a new problem, after all, this city above all, with the Nobel Prize emanating from here, should be aware of how important the industrialization of war, the effects of industrialization were on war and on its conduct. And the pace of technological and industrial change since roughly the mid-19th century has presented war with constant change from the bottom up. And the result has been, of course, the tendency to prioritize that technological change in ways which can have, I would argue, effects which lead us to underestimate the role of continuing factors. To give you a very small example, in the 1990s, the Americans, looking back on the arrival, relatively recent arrival of precision-guided munitions, satellite reconnaissance, GPS systems, and so on, were wont to say, under the label of the Revolutionary Military Affairs, so-called, that the fog of war had been lifted, that now the clarity of the battlefield was obvious, that you could identify your targets, you could hit your targets with precision, and above all, of course, this implied continuing American dominance within the battle space. And that essentially means, for some American commentators, that what I've just said to you was completely irrelevant, that it had lost its applicability. So, do we actually overestimate the effects of new technology on war?